Hey everyone, and welcome to our June live event for National Sewing Circle. Once again, we have Nicki here to answer all of your sewing questions. So thanks for being here, Nicki.
Hey everybody, glad to be here.
So before we get into your questions, which of course, if you have them, go ahead and start entering those into the chat box and we'll start working our way through them over the next hour. But I did want to let everyone know that we have a new challenge going on. If you have done some challenges with us in the past, and this one is through our sister site, National Quilter Circle, but you should see a banner somewhere on the page of the video you're watching right now. And it's a fun quilt with some applique options. So even if you're not a quilter, there's definitely still some options for you if you want to get into quilting or if you really like doing applique. Please join us for that, and you can sign up. It is free just by clicking on the link on the banner on the screen, putting in your email. You can download fabric requirements, and that starts the 21st. So the first block comes out the 21st. And then every week thereafter. So definitely join us for that. It'll be a lot of fun. And we're also working with AccuQuilt on that one. So if you have an AccuQuilt cutter, we're working with them on that to be able to do some fun applique shapes and things like that. So definitely join us for that challenge. But we are going to get through answering some of your sewing questions this evening. And our first one comes from Eric, which is fitting since I was talking about applique. But he wants to know, is there an easy way to sew on very small applique letters or prints that I've made using the Cricut? I have several about 1 inch by 1 inch, and the lines to sew on are barely enough to use a straight stitch on. So do you have any tips for him?
For sewing really tiny things, if it's really not possible to make your zigzag stitch narrow enough to get around those tiny little edges, you could cheat a little bit and just use a really, really strong adhesive, like a really strong fusible web. I was actually just reading about something called Ultra Hold, which I guess is a really super strong version of like heat and bond. So you could do something like that and just hope that it, stands up and won't wash away if it's going to go on something that you'll be washing and using a lot. If it's something that you won't be washing and using a lot, then that would probably work just fine, I would think, so that you don't have to work real hard to get around those tiny, tiny little corners. And a lot of times those little pieces will get kind of eaten up by your thread if you're trying to satin stitch around the edge. So yeah, like I said, if making your zigzag stitch really, really narrow doesn't work, maybe try that Ultra Hold.
Yes, and I feel like usually at some point during these, you mentioned a product that I know I have somewhere in my room. It's like not reachable right now, and that is one of them. But I will say, so if you've never used the Ultra Hold before, and I don't quote me on the colors because I might get them wrong, but so in the Heat and Bond packages, there's usually like a pink package and a light purple, and the Ultra one is like the red package. So I think I accidentally bought that one time, but it does work really, really well. Just to kind of follow up on that one real quick, because I'm in my head, I'm thinking, he's trying to stitch lines, and if you can't stitch, just right along the edge of something, would you ever maybe make your zigzag wider and just stitch entirely over the shape maybe, rather than trying to go around the edge? Is that an option or just an idea?
Yeah, I think that would be possible depending on the width of it. But if your zigzag stitch gets too wide, and I know, your sewing machine will max out at a certain, width, but I don't think you want to do a satin stitch that's too wide, just because it's more likely to get caught on things as you're wearing it or using it. So you don't want it to get too crazy on the width. But yeah, depending on what you're sewing and the size of the thing that you're appliquing, yeah, I'd play around with that too.
Yeah, perfect. All right, our next question here, this comes from Lou Goldman, and he says, I love to make different sizes of zipper pouches. I know you can shorten nylon zippers, but how do you shorten metal zippers, and is it even possible?
It is definitely possible, yes. But not the same way, because you can't just cut through metal teeth like you can just cut off the bottom of your nylon zipper. So you'll need a pair of pliers or a tool that's called a nipper, which I guess it's different than pliers. I don't know. But I was working on Sew It All TV many years ago, and it was Julie Tierney, and Ashley and I talked about this for a different reason.
The jacket that we couldn't remember her name, right?
Yes, the jacket. So she showed this, and she has instructions on sewitalltv.com, and you can look up, you know, they've got tutorials for anything you want on the internet. But so for shortening a metal zipper, so I actually grabbed one out of my sewing box so I can show you. To shorten a metal zipper, you want to measure your desired length from the lower stop. So mark, if you just want to cut an inch off the top, you would mark that, measure from the bottom up and mark, because you're going to be cutting off of the top. And if you want to put these top stops back on, you want to make sure you save those. Just after you pull them off with your pliers, set them to the side and don't lose them. But if you're inserting this zipper into a seam where, you know, the top part is going to get inserted into the seam anyway, you don't really need those top stops. So say you wanted to cut your zipper off like right here. You want to remove these metal teeth about an inch, like a half inch, no, like an inch above where you want it to stop. So taking your nippers or your pliers, you just pull off those teeth one at a time. And you might get a little bit of damage done to your zipper, so you just want to really be careful. And, you know, some brands of zippers, it'll be easier on than others, but, you know, you just kind of work it off. And if your zipper tape is really strong, that helps too. It helps them, you know, to minimize the damage to the tape. Just pull those teeth off and pinch the top stops back on wherever you want them on. Your desired length of zipper if you want those top stops. And that's all there is to it. So yeah, just get some elbow grease in there and yank off those metal teeth. But yeah, it's totally doable. It just takes, you know, a little extra time and consideration. But yeah, definitely do it.
So I think we've mentioned in the past non-traditional items that we have in our sewing room. Like we both have a rolling pin for working with leather and things like that. I have a hammer for whenever I'm doing grommets or eyelets or things like that. So pliers and nippers, I guess I'm gonna have to get those to add in there as well.
Yeah, some stuff from your husband's toolbox.
Exactly, it's really my toolbox, let's be honest. All right, so our next question here. They're making a skirt with an asymmetrical hem. Can fabric be cut from the waist rather than the bottom of the dress? The fabric has an embroidered edge. I'm assuming they want to take it up a little bit and not lose that fancy hem or the embroidered edge.
Yeah, so if you're trying to preserve that lower edge, you can cut, yeah, however it needs to happen in order to pull that fabric up to keep the embroidery on the hem where you want it. So yeah, without seeing exactly how that project is going, it's hard for me to really describe or to help, but hopefully, yes, you can, is a helpful answer.
So I have a follow-up based off of the image in my head, which I'm not sure that's going to get us anywhere. But so I'm picturing if you have, we'll just say it's a drastic A-line skirt per se, and you need to hem it 3 inches. So if you're trying to take 3 inches out of the waistband, obviously the further down you get on your skirt, it's a lot wider than the waistband. So how do you gather it back in to the waistband?
Okay, yeah. So you could either go at it from a pattern making perspective and kind of shrink it so that the cut line or the seam line at the waist of the skirt will match the waistband, or you could just gather that extra fullness in, because like you said, if you're cutting further down on that A line, the seam line is going to be longer. So you could do something as simple as just a gathering stitch. So crank your stitch length up to your basting stitch, which is just your longest stitch length, and stitch a line about 1/4 inch in from the seam line, and gather it up so that the seam line will match your waistband, and just stitch along the seam line, and you're going to get nips and tucks and gathers. So that's what that's good, you know, in a gathered skirt. That's, you know, that's what you want. It's cute. So that's going to gather in that extra fullness so that the seam line of the skirt will still match your waistband.
Perfect. See, I knew you'd know what I was saying.
Yeah.
All right, next question here. This is from Joyce. She says that her question has to do with iron-on interfacing. Usually the instructions call for me to cut a pattern piece from the interfacing and then iron it onto the fabric piece. Why can't I iron the interfacing to the fabric first and then cut the pattern piece so I only have to cut once? Is there a reason patterns call for cutting the interfacing separately?
That's a really good question, Joyce, and that is not something that I have thought of before. I think, boy, it might have something to do with like shrinkage, the way that, I don't know if when you're ironing it onto your fabric, it might, I don't know, it might pull grain line differently maybe. But yeah, I know that's what I've always done myself, is cutting them separately and then fusing them on. And you know, a lot of times my cuts don't match, which is fine. It doesn't have to match perfectly. It just needs to match enough that your interfacing is going to be getting into the seam line enough that it is locked in there. So yeah, I don't know why, because I've never tried it the way that you're describing.
So I have a hunch.
Theories?
Mine's coming from a totally different like thought process as yours. Mine is coming from I want to use my leftover fabric in something else, and I don't maybe want to have interfacing on that fabric, right? So if I, rather than cut out just a rectangle and then, because then all my scraps are going to have that fusible interfacing on them. So I guess that's where my head went with it, is that maybe they're doing it so then that way you can always use your leftover scraps of fabric without interfacing.
Yeah, that makes sense, because you would have a little bit of that interfacing left over on the edges of your cut. Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay, so you mentioned that sometimes your fabric and your interfacing, they aren't cut perfectly the same, right? There's a little bit off. So then which one do you adjust, right? So do you assume that your interfacing was cut correctly because it's stiffer and harder to accidentally skew if you're using maybe a lighter weight fabric, or how do you decide which one gets pulled to which?
It depends on how much off my cuts are. Sometimes I'll split the difference, or sometimes I think more often it's my interfacing that gets trimmed. Like if my interfacing was accidentally bigger than my fabric piece, I'll just trim the interfacing to match so that I'm not like gluing my interfacing onto the ironing board. And also I don't want to have to recut a larger piece of fabric. So I would just kind of assume that that was something wonky that happened, you know, in cutting my interfacing, and I would trust that I was probably a little more careful when I was cutting. I would hope I was a little more careful when I was cutting my fabric. Not always true, but so yeah, I guess it all depends, but more often than not, I trust myself on my fabric. And if my interfacing is ends up smaller than my fabric piece, I just center it like on a waistband or something. I'll just center it on the rectangle and call it good, because it's not, you know, it doesn't, like I said, it doesn't need to get interfaced all the way to the cut edge. It just needs to be far enough into the seam line that it's locking it in there.
Yeah, perfect. All right, next question here. Mirna asks, where can we find a step-by-step guide or instructions to learn how to make simple and basic dress patterns?
Oh, there are so many resources out there. Simple Simon and Company is one that pops into mind. They do a lot of kids things, but I know they have some adult tutorials as well. There aren't any websites that are coming to mind for simple basic dress patterns right now, but you can always just type into your search bar exactly what you're looking for, and you'd be amazed how much information there is out there for exactly what you want. And I love that home sewing has kind of made this huge comeback in recent years, and there are a whole bunch of sewing blogs out there, really professional sewing blogs too, with great pictures and step-by-step tutorials. I know there are a whole bunch of basic, simple projects on sewitalltv.com and sewitallmag.com, because Sew It All, the magazine and the TV show, was geared toward beginners, so they always had really nice, simple, basic projects. I don't remember if there are any dresses in there, but there might be. And yeah, there's just, I'm sure you could probably also find some more simple designs on some of the big three pattern company websites: McCall, Simplicity. There's Vogue, there's Berta Style too. So yeah, there are so many resources out there that sometimes it can be overwhelming.
Yes, it's true. We're like 15 minutes in and I haven't said this yet, so I'm gonna have to say it, but we have a video on National Sewing Circle, and I know it's there because I actually did it, and it is a very easy step-by-step video on how to do a basic, like a summer dress based off of your own measurements. So think of like, I don't want to say like a really long shirt, but kind of like, it's, you know, very simple measurements. You only need a few of them. So I know that one's on there. And then I just had to giggle because I've never heard of Easy Pattern, or I've never thought of Easy Pattern and Vogue like in the same sentence before. So, but I love their patterns, like, but I mean, that has been some of the most, like, if you think of the times you've been the most frustrated with the pattern, where you're just like, oh, I'm gonna start over, it's always been Vogue. But like, if you want a challenge, like if you can master one of their patterns, like you are getting there in your sewing skills for sure.
Yes, those patterns do tend to be more complex. And actually, speaking of pattern companies, I haven't touched a pattern from one of the big pattern companies in a really long time, because I'm either drawing my own or I'm going to some of the smaller and, you know, independent pattern companies. I think Simple Simon and Company has a pattern line of their own, and I know Melissa, her website is mellysews.com. I forget what her pattern line is called, but she has a pattern line too, a lot of kids things and a lot of other really cute stuff. But yeah, if you have a small, like, indie quilt shop or fabric shop, a lot of times they will carry some of those smaller companies as well. So look for those pattern envelopes that look a little bit different than the pattern envelopes you're used to seeing, and support those guys, because they're doing really cool stuff and changing the way that patterns look and patterns instructions are written to make them more user-friendly and more intuitive, which I love. So branch out, and like I said, there's just so much out there. You'll definitely be able to find exactly what you want if you look.
For sure. Yes. All right. Our next question here, Peggy says, when sewing a dart, is it ever okay to trim the extra fabric left by the dart? I noticed that in my blouses, there is never extra fabric. It's also very noticeable on white blouses and sheer fabrics.
Yes, it is definitely okay to trim that dart, that extra dart fabric. You can just treat it like a seam allowance. Just make sure you finish it afterward with a zigzag stitch, or however is easiest for you to finish it. And that will get rid of some bulk from the dart. If you're using a fabric that is a little bit heavier, a little thicker fabric, you don't want that, you know, that kind of a bump where your dart is. So you can trim that out, finish the seam allowances either separately or together. And yeah, just press it to the side. And yeah, that's definitely a good thing to do with sheer blouses as well, or, you know, white blouses where you could see that extra fabric, is try and trim it down to make it as small as you can. So yeah, definitely.
So then, in your opinion, what is more noticeable, extra fabric on a sheer blouse or a big zigzag seam on the inside of a sheer blouse?
I think the extra fabric is more noticeable, because there would be more of it. So if you would trim it down, then you would just have a narrow strip. And if you want to zigzag finish it, make sure your zigzag is, you know, short enough to catch those threads and keep it from fraying, but also you don't want to like satin stitch the edge because that's going to create some bulk of its own. So that zigzag stitch, you know, not too narrow, but just wide enough to finish the edge and also not be super noticeable.
Right, perfect. All right, next one here. Anna says, when altering jeans these days, they almost always have spandex. Do you use a ballpoint needle or a jeans needle?
That's a good question too. Yeah, I know I'm always saying, you know, if you're sewing something stretchy, use a stretch needle. But if you're sewing a woven, you want to use your all-purpose needle. So the lines do get blurred. I would say still use either an all-purpose needle or a denim needle if you're doing, you know, your flat felled seam on the side or your hem. The denim needle has a reinforced shaft and a really sharp, strong point to really drive through those thick denim layers. So that's what it's designed for. Because while, yes, there is some spandex in your jeans, the percentage still is probably pretty small. And it's mostly your cotton blend for your jeans. And denim, it's got a twill weave usually, so it's a really tight, strong weave. So you want a needle that's going to drive through that weave and the fabric, especially when you get a couple layers together. So I'd say still use your jeans needle.
Perfect. And so I think we might have touched on this in the past as well, because I know we've talked a lot about needles in the past. But so along that same lines, if you're sewing two different fabrics together, so say for some reason you are sewing 100% spandex to 100% denim, do you always just sort of err towards the, I think you said, the most difficult fabric, or you know, how do you pick from there?
Yes. Take the steps to make sure your most finicky fabric will be happy. So if you're sewing a cotton fabric onto a knit fabric, which a lot of times, you know, it's kind of a more popular thing nowadays, I would use a needle and a thread for that knit fabric. So your ballpoint needle and your all-purpose thread to make sure that your knit fabric is taken care of and it's happy. Because, you know, your woven fabric is, it's not as finicky, and you don't need to do as much to make sure that that is going to look nice and sew nice.
Perfect. One other follow-up to that is along the same lines, how do you decide what fabric to put on top or not when you're sewing them, if they're totally different fabrics?
Yes. So on the bottom of your sewing machine bed, you've got your feed dogs. So the feed dogs kind of pull your fabric along. So it's going to pull the lower layer of fabric along. So I would stitch with my knit fabric on the bottom to make sure that that is sliding along nicely and keeping the edges even at the edge of your seam line. Or if you've got, like I do, I've got my integrated dual feed foot on my super sweet Hough Passport 2.0. I can engage my dual feed foot, and it's like another set of feed dogs on the bottom of my presser foot, which is really nice. So it doesn't matter if I've got my knit fabric on the top and bottom, and it's super nice when I'm just sewing knit fabric because I've got, you know, those feed dogs on both sides pulling the fabric at the same rate. You can also use a walking foot if you don't have this integrated dual feed foot. So a walking foot would work, which is a lot of times used when you're quilting to keep all the layers of your quilts moving along at the same rate and not so that you don't get shifting between the layers. You could use a roller foot to help roll that fabric along a Teflon foot actually also works, and we're getting off on a tangent now. But so I'm kind of answering my own question of how you keep your layers moving at the same rate so that they don't shift, and so that, you know, you keep everything nice and even at the edges. There is something called it's either called a velvet foot or a knit foot, and I can't remember. I know I used it when I was sewing a velvet skirt, because when you get velvet on velvet, it's got a pile, so it gets a lot of shifting, and I used that foot for that. And that foot just, it's got a really narrow foot, so that there's less of it pushing down on the fabric. I don't even remember what the initial question was.
That's right. We went down, we ran through all the feet. Okay. I have to say, you even threw in a little quilting there. I feel like it's only been several years. I feel like the quilting's, you know, rubbing off on you now. We're going to get you over to the quilting side.
It is. I've been learning a lot from you, answering all of my quilting questions for me.
Perfect. Oh, good. All right. Well, next one here, definitely not quilting related, but Bev wants to know if you can smock over smocking to make the top smaller.
So if we are talking about real smocking, I don't know. But if we're talking about the fake smocking, like more like shearing, if you're using an elastic thread in your bobbin to gather up the fabric, I would say I don't really think so. I would be afraid that you would just get a lot of thread and a lot of like tucks going on. So to make a sheared top or a smock top smaller, I feel like your best bet would be to nip in at the side seams. Ashley, did you read that question differently than me?
No, same. So I'm thinking, so when I think of like a smocked top, I think of the traditional honeycomb pattern. You're bringing in all these little tiny, and if you're trying to do that again, like you're going to make, your top is going to go from being like this thick to this thick, right? Because you're trying to really fold it in on it. So I feel like the only way that you could smock over smocking, which is just fun to say, is if it's like a different smocked pattern. So I think it's called like Canadian smocking, is the real decorative stuff you normally see on pillows and things like that, but it's a more open design, not so tight, and like something like that, then you could definitely go in between those smock designs and pull it in a little bit. So I'm going to say it's going to have to depend on how smocked your smocking is, if you can smock over the smocking.
It's like how much wood come down.
Yeah, perfect. All right, next question here. Simone says that she struggles measuring my fabric or using a ruler to measure fabric. I second guess myself and tend to measure things over and over. I try to create templates to help myself, but what are some tips you can provide, and what should be a simple task for measuring?
So for measuring, it is good to be careful and, you know, measure twice, cut once. But when you are measuring and like cutting out your fabric, or just, you know, measuring whatever you're measuring on your fabric, a couple of tips that come off the top of my head would be, make sure all of your fabric is on the table. So if you're trying to cut or measure on a table and half your fabric is hanging over the edge, it's going to be pulling, and it's going to distort your grain lines. And if it's a knit, it's going to stretch whatever you're cutting. It's going to stretch it out, and it's just not good. So make sure it's all on the table and nothing is pulling. Also make sure you have a good, you know, you're measuring on a nice flat, hard surface, and you've got a good ruler. So a good ruler can really help make things a lot easier. I have been using a flimsy 2x18 ruler for a long time, and it's not the best. I should really invest in a better ruler because I know it would make my life a lot easier. I have used thicker rulers before, and I really like those. I feel like those are more like quilting rulers. But the really thick rectangular rulers just feel sturdier to me, and like they're not gonna move around on you when you place it somewhere to measure something. So yeah, those would be some general tips for measuring. And Ashley is getting her rulers ready, so let's show us some rulers.
Well, I finally have, like I mentioned, when we talk about something, they're normally like out of my reach, but they're actually right here in front of me. But so just because the question did mention cutting templates too, my head went towards like a quilting side of measuring things. But so you were talking about flimsy rulers. I definitely don't ever use like a super flimsy one. I'll use a flexible measuring tape for, you know, body measurements or something. But I always use as big, thick acrylic rulers. So I would recommend these for sure. And then just like things that I think about when I'm cutting things out is be consistent as to whether you measure off of your ruler or whether you measure off of your cutting mat. Because I feel like sometimes it could be just a little bit different. So if you use your mat all the time, use your mat. If you use your ruler, just kind of pick one or the other. And then the other little thing I wanted to try, I don't know if I can show this, but if you are, say, going to cut a little square and this is your ruler, the line that you want to be cutting off of, make sure that your fabric is completely underneath that line. So if you're trying to cut a 2-inch square, you want that fabric to be directly under that line. No fabric is extending beyond it or it'll be too big, but you also don't want to see any space between your fabric and your line. So like, I hope that makes sense, to be exactly underneath the line, but that's just going to help you be super consistent as well. So just get fun little rulers like this and practice cutting 2-inch squares. And if you can cut small little things like that, you'll definitely be able to cut bigger pieces as well. So hopefully between the two answers, that gives you a lot of things to practice and work on. All right, our next one here, Judy says, can you please explain how to adjust tension on a newish machine? I understand how to adjust the top tension, but sometimes it does not do the job, and I wonder if the bobbin tension is set wrong. Is it hard to figure out which way to turn the tiny screw and how much?
So to change the tension on your bobbin is like a last resort for me. You know, you want to make sure you go through my checklist first because I have a tension checklist. And if absolutely nothing works, then I would go to changing the tension on your bobbin, because it can be a little tricky, and very, very minute adjustments to the screw can make a big difference. And every machine is different. So, so changing tension, you know, it can be vastly different from machine manufacturer to machine manufacturer. So if the instructions are not in your machine manual, then I would go and do an internet search. But check your manual first. But I know a lot of times machine manufacturers don't really want you touching the bobbin tension, either because they want you to take it to the sewing machine doctor and, you know, have them do it for you, or because they don't want you, you know, messing around in the innards of the machine, and it might be better left to a professional. But some machines make it easier for you. Sometimes it is right there in the machine manual. They tell you step by step how to do it. I actually just looked up online how to change bobbin tension, and a Brother tutorial came up. So Brother has instructions online on how to do it, and it might be different from model to model too. So make sure you insert your model number in your Google search when you're searching for that. And if the machine manufacturer doesn't provide instructions online either, you might be able to find some information in forums. Someone who has the same machine as you may have figured out how to do it and posted instructions. So it might take a little bit of digging, but I know that you want to do the turns to the little screw in small increments, like quarter turn increments, like 45 degrees, and test it out. And one tip that I read was on the bobbin case to mark the default position of the screw with like a permanent marker on the bobbin case, so that after you make the adjustments, you can go back to the manufacturer's default setting if you need to.
Mm-hmm. Yes, perfect. I haven't had to do that in a long time because my fancy machine does it for me now. It like senses everything and just automatically adjusts. You just tell it what fabric you're sewing on, and then it's ready to go.
You just press go and it does everything for you.
Pretty much. Like, it's definitely smarter than I am. Like, our next question here, Blanca says, how do you sew lace?
Sewing lace. So lace comes in so many different varieties that you will need to take more considerations for some than others. So some general lace sewing tips I would say are using French seams to finish your seams, because the weave on a lot of laces is so open that using a zigzag stitch to finish your seam allowances isn't really feasible. So French seams finish off your seam allowances and they look nice. So the French seam is just you sew your fabric with wrong sides together first, and then flip it around to have the right sides together and sew it again to encase your seam allowances. And of course you would trim it down, and that was a really bad tutorial.
We have a video on National Sewing Circle on how to do French seams. You can watch it step by step. But just because a follow up to that real quick, because I'm curious about how you do it, because I had a discussion with my mom the other day on how she does a French seam, and I've always done 3/8 first, trimmed it down, flipped it, and then stitched a quarter. How do you do yours?
That is how I do mine as well. That's how I learned, so that's just what's easiest for me. Yeah.
All right, I'm glad that you sided with me. But if that made no sense to you, then go to nationalsewingcircle.com and watch the full tutorial on how to do a French seam. All right, our next one here, Linda asks, how can I get a t-shirt neckband to stay flat? More often than not, my band sticks up like a mandarin collar.
Yes, that happens sometimes, and it could be a couple of things. So it could be that your fabric that you're using is just kind of a little bit thicker and doesn't have as much stretch as what is intended by the pattern. So you can try a couple of things. So you can try making the neckband just a little bit smaller. And also you can try cutting the neckband on the bias. So even if you're using a knit fabric and it's going to stretch, no matter if you cut it on the perpendicular or parallel grain line, cutting it on the bias will allow it to kind of conform around curves even better. So like double knit fabrics, a lot of times behave almost like a woven fabric because they're so stiff. So cutting that neckband on the bias will allow it to curve really nicely around your neckline. Cutting it a little bit smaller and then easing it in can help. Instead of having that neckband sticking up like that, it would help it lay flatter against your shoulder. If the pattern for the neckband is too long and you need to shorten the pattern, and you want to measure it out and remake the pattern for it, you can measure the neckline of the shirt along the seam line, and use your flexible measuring tape, set it on the end to curve it around and measure. Measure just the seam line, not the seam allowances, to get the neckline. And I've actually seen a couple different formulas for this, because you want your neckband to be smaller than the neckline so that it eases in. You can either multiply that neckline measurement by 0.15, so 15%, or I also saw one formula that said 2/3. So you might have a little, you might need to try a couple different things to see what would work best for what fabric you're using. So when you are inserting your neckband into your neckline, you want to quarter mark it. So marking the back, the front, and the equal sides, and then quarter mark the neckline as well, and then match your pins and stretch the neckband, only the neckband. You don't want to stretch your shirt at all, just the neckband to match the shirt neckline, so that it eases in, and stitch slowly so you don't get puckers in your shirt. You just want it, the neckband to stretch enough so that when it's all sewn in and you release it, that neckband will shrink up and lay flat against your skin and fit into that seam line along the neckline perfectly. So a couple different things you can try. Hopefully that will help that neckband lay flat and not stick up. Also, make sure you try hitting it with a little steam afterwards too. And if you lay it flat on your ironing board, hit it with steam and try and kind of mold it with your fingers. Sometimes some different knits will be a little bit more willing to let you kind of mold it with steam and then let it cool. And sometimes that'll help too.
Perfect. All right, our next one here, Anna asks, when taking in a waist, how do you know whether to take in the sides or the seam in the back?
That depends on what, it depends on the garment. It depends on how much needs to be taken in. It depends on what other elements are on the garment. So if you've got a skirt that's got like patch pockets on the sides and it's too close to the seam, the side seams, and you can't take in the side seams without nipping into the patch pockets, you might want to take it out from the back. But whenever possible, I would say take from the side seams so that you can split it, because taking like an inch out from the back seam can just kind of skew your grain line. It can skew, it's going to pull the side seams back and it can just kind of throw the fit off. So if you need to take an inch out, you can, and if you can take it out from the side seams, you can split it. So taking a ½ inch out from each side will keep their proportions nice and equal and even, and keep your garment hanging nicely and preserve those elements of fit. So I recommend, whenever possible, take it out from equally from each side seam.
Perfect. All right, next one here, Joyce wants to know, can you explain how to hem pants on a sewing machine?
So to hem pants, so if you made a pair of pants and you want to hem them on a sewing machine, you can do your regular, double fold, or you can do, like, if you're doing trousers and you want to do a nice invisible finish, you can do the blind hem stitch. So doing a blind hem on your sewing machine, if you have a blind hem foot, it is helpful. So the blind hem foot just has this little flange in the middle. You can see that. And your sewing machine, a lot of sewing machines are built in with a blind hem stitch, which just looks like, it's like 3 straight stitches with then a zigzag stitch popping in. So the only tricky thing about doing a blind hem stitch on the machine is the way you fold the fabric. So you fold your hem to the wrong side and then fold it back under so that you are stitching your straight stitches on the hem allowance, and the zigzag stitch that pops in to take a little bite out of the face fabric, or the fabric that is, showing on the right side of the garment. And the flange of that blind hem foot will run right along the fold. So when you fold your hem allowance back under to you would be folding it to the right side. with right sides together. And you would fold it so that, I forget how much, maybe like a 1/4 inch? No, less than a 1/4 inch. I'm not, please tell me you have a video on this.
It's funny, but so as I was reading this question to you, I was smiling to myself, like, I want to see how she's going to explain the folding for this with 0 props. Like, I was just picturing it happening. But yes, we have a video on National Sewing Circle. One of our other instructors, Aurora, did a great video on actually showing with a pair of pants, because I know I've demonstrated it, I think even on some Facebook Lives, with just a scrap of fabric, which definitely is a good way to practice the folding. So you make sure that you're stitching on the right and wrong side, but she actually demonstrates it using an actual pair of pants. So if you want to make sure you're seeing, you know, what is the lining of the pants, what is the right side, like, yes, we have a full tutorial on that. And I think it's 3/8 of an inch. You need a little bit more than a 1/4, just so that you can actually catch it. And because if you try to go too narrow, like, you're not going to catch it with your stitch. And then also it's like you're not on that far right feed dog. So like I have sometimes a hard time getting it through the machine, but yep, it's all covered in an awesome tutorial.
Good.
Perfect. All right, and next one here, and it says, how do you change a shirt pattern for a large bust so that the shirt fits well?
So to do a pattern adjustment for a large bust, that's called a full bust adjustment. And I'm going to direct you to the curvysewingcollective.com. Let me make sure I've got that URL right, because you only have to look at me to know I have not done very many full bust adjustments in my life. But the curvysewingcollective.com has a great tutorial. You can search their website for full bust adjustment, and that is abbreviated FBA. You can search FBA, and they have a really good tutorial with lots of pictures and really good instructions. And you know, you can search full bust adjustment or FBA just anywhere on the internet and find a whole bunch of tutorials as well. But they have a really good one, and whenever I get asked about that, that is where I direct people to go. So curvysewingcollective.com, they have a whole bunch of, it's a really great website. They have a whole bunch of pattern alterations tips and sewing tips, especially for, as the name implies, curvy people. So that's a really good resource.
Perfect. I'm sure it's a wonderful resource. I don't want to take away from that at all. But if you're already on National Sewing Circle, because you're learning how to do a French seam and you're learning how to do your blind hem, one of our, actually an old coworker of ours, Beth Bradley, does a step-by-step tutorial on how to do a full bust adjustment as well. So sometimes, you know, if you are someone who can read a tutorial and get it seeing pictures, that would be an awesome resource. If you need a video or you just need to see it 2 and 3 times, you know, before it really clicks, it's always good to see it, you know, from multiple sources and multiple different people, because some people explain things differently, and you'll definitely find the one that works for you. All right, Lynn wants to know, when lining drapes or curtains, is the lining hem tucked in under the drapery curtain hem, or is the lining hem left to the outside of the drapery curtain hem and then hemmed separately?
So I believe that when sewing a lined curtain, they are supposed to be left separate, kind of like, you know, wearing a slip under a skirt. The hem is done separately. So you hem the lining and you hem the face fabric, and then they're joined at the sides. And I'm not an expert on sewing curtains. I haven't done that very much, but I know that much. That's the one thing that stuck in my head.
It's funny because I also have not really sewn a whole lot of curtains, and the new house we just moved into has shutters, so I don't even have to purchase a curtain. But if you're already on National Sewing Circle, we have a couple videos on curtains as well. DJ Humbach does several of them, and I don't know for sure if she covers specifically lined curtains and how to hem them, but I know she has done a couple tutorials on curtains, so I'm sure that is something that is covered in that as well. All right, our next one here, Linda wants to know, what is a good way to add prairie points to the edge of your quilt binding? I knew you could answer some quilt questions.
Ashley.
I know. Okay, so I'm going to say, it's funny because I'm actually next week filming a video on how to do prairie points. So that'll be available soon. But so a prairie point is essentially a folded piece of fabric that looks like that. So you have a square, right? And you fold it in half, and then you fold it in half again. And then this cute little finished fold is what sticks out away from the edge of your quilt, right? So on a sewing term, I'm going to say pretend this is the curve of rickrack. And like, what are your tips for adding rickrack to the edge of something?
Let's see.
Throwing you a curveball here.
Yeah, because I had no idea what prairie points were before you just showed that to me. So I was completely in the dark.
We like to keep you on your toes. We've been having you do this for a while, so we feel like we've got to keep changing it up and asking you different questions, you know?
Yeah, no, that's good. Keep me on my toes. I like it. So if I were treating it like rickrack, I guess for rickrack, you know, you just want to make sure you're lining the rickrack up so that the center of the rickrack is right on your seam line. And you know, I would pin, if my rickrack is going this way, I would pin this way with my rickrack instead of this way. Mm-hmm. Just, I don't know if that applies to prairie points too. Help me, Ashley.
So I honestly, and I'm going to say, whenever I've done prairie points, it's been instead of a binding, because right, a binding is a way to finish the edge. But if I'm going to do a prairie point, then I'm just going to put it, you know, on my raw edge of my quilt. So here we're going to do a super miniature version. Here's a quilt. Here's my folded prairie point. We're going to line up those raw edges so the point is going inward. And then when you put your top with your back, or however it is you're going to finish it, then once you stitch it and turn it right side out, then you're going to have this nice finished point just right along the edge. So that's always the way that I have done them, is instead of a binding. Or if you have a quilt and you've already made it and you've done the binding, and you want to then add them to the back, like, you still can do that, but then you're going to have to come in and sew another little strip to kind of cover up those raw edges. So it's just, I think, much easier to do it instead of a binding, have that be your fun edge, and then right sides together, finish it sort of a, what do they call that, the pillowcase finish, where you have it right sides together, you leave your opening and then you turn it. So that's how I would do it. But. And
then you would kind of lay them on top of each other, right? So that
yes.
When you turn it up, they meet. So you would have to kind of overlap the triangles on the wrong side so that where those triangles meet would be right on your seam line, right?
Yes. And it's all in how you fold them. I know these are the tiniest squares. It just happens to be what's in front of me. But so when you fold them, you have an opening on one side. And so this is called nesting points. And so you can actually, it's like a little fortune cookie, right? So you open it up and so you nest it one over the other. And then you just keep going in and in and in. So you can put them as close or as far apart as you want. But yeah, you definitely want to make sure that you have your stitching on that 1/4 inch seam allowance. You want to make sure that your valley of your points is, you know, at least 1/4 inch up away. But so yeah, it's all in how you fold them. But if you want to see an awesome tutorial in like a week when I get it done, then I'm also going to show how to make continuous prairie points and things like that. So all sorts of prairie point fun.
Yeah, I'm going to check out that video. I might have to add some prairie points to something.
They're super cute. I like them. All right, next here, Pamela wants to know, how do you make bias tape out of fabric?
So making bias tape out of fabric is super easy, and I highly recommend it. Making your own bias tape, because you can match your fabric and you can match your fiber contents, so everything is going to mesh really well together. So, and it's super easy. So making your own bias tape out of fabric, you can either cut, lay it out and cut it on the bias at your 45 degree angle, cut your strips however wide you need them to be. You can also do something called continuous bias binding, which I have a video on. I'm going to steal your line, Ashley.
Dang it, I was ready too. I knew it.
I did a tutorial on that on nationalsewingcircle.com. I think it's part of my intermediate sewing skills video. So I have like an hour or an hour and a half of sewing tips, and the continuous bias binding is in there. Or you can, you can look it up as well. There's a formula and there's a certain way to cut stuff. I think you should watch me do it because I do a really good job explaining it. I'm not going to explain it now because we only have a couple minutes left and I wanted to get to the bias tape maker. So once you get your bias strips either cut by hand and then you would stitch them together, this way to get your, I'm like doing all of my
your L seam to get it so when it opens up.
Thank you, your L seam, or however you get your bias strips. Then to fold it into bias binding, you can do it the long way and do it each edge by hand and scorch your fingertips, or you can get a handy dandy bias tape maker, which is really cool. It makes it really easy. They come in a whole bunch of different widths, which can be a little tricky, but the width that is listed on the package is the width of the single fold binding. So if you are doing a double fold binding and you want it to end up 1/2 inch stitched and finished, you're going to purchase the 1 inch bias tape maker. Clover, it's the 25 millimeter, and you're going to be cutting your strips at 2 inches. So you cut your 2 inch strip. This thing is going to help you fold in your long raw edges to the center, making it a 1 inch strip. And then when you apply it to your raw edge, it's going to be folded in half again, making it 1/2 inch. So a little tricky, but the number on the package is going to be double your finished binding. So when you've got your bias strip, I like to cut the short end at an angle to help it feed through here easier. So this is the top, and then that would be the bottom. So you feed it through the wide end, and sometimes you have to use a pin and get the pin down in there to help pull it out the short end. And when it comes out the short end, it's like a little seashell in here. It kind of wraps those edges around as it's pulling through. So you can pin that starting end to your ironing board and pull this out a little bit at a time. Take your iron and press, pull, and then press. And you kind of have to finagle with it a little bit to make sure those raw edges are not exactly meeting in the middle. You want to leave a tiny little gap so that there's not a lot of bunching inside your binding when you're wrapping it around your raw edge. But if you're pulling and putting a little bit of tension on the rest of your fabric and pressing, I find that you don't have to mess with it too much. Just keep an eye on it, and then just pull your fabric through, keep pressing, and you'll have your binding single folded. And then you can either fold it in half again and press it to get your center fold, or you can leave it as your single fold and apply it to your quilt or whatever you're applying it to, and just wrap it around and use it as you would store-bought binding. But it's even better because you get to choose. You have a much wider array of color and print choices if you're making your own binding from any fabric you want, rather than the very limited selection of pre-made bias bindings in the store.
Absolutely. And of course, you want to see that in action. I did a video on National Sewing Circle on how to use the bias binder. We're going to get everything covered eventually with videos. All right, so I know we're about out of time, but we have just had 2 more questions that came in live, and I want if you can touch on them. I'm not going to say like speed answer them, but
Okay.
You know what I mean? All right. Okay, so our question here, Anna says, can you explain when to use some of the overlocking stitches on a regular sewing machine if you don't have a serger? My machine has about 3, but I'm not sure if some are better than others to use. So how do you know when to use an overlocking stitch?
So the overlocking stitches are great for finishing edges, and that is, you know, that's the main use of them. And that's, you know, the zigzag stitch is the most common overlocking stitch. So yeah, let's see, for finishing edges, and you know, the zigzag stitch. What are some other overlocking stitches other than a zigzag stitch?
So my machine, and not even just my fancy machine that I like to talk about, but my other machine had one as well, and I'm going to do my best to draw this, and let's not all judge me later. But so it looks something like, if you can see this. Okay,
Yeah.
and so it has a straight line down on one side, and then it looks like some diamonds coming together, and that's a great one to use if you're going along the edge of something, and if you're doing that kind of overlocking stitch specifically to finish off the edge of the fabric. Get an overlocking foot, so it looks like your regular zigzag foot, but it has a bar down the middle of it, so that when you line that bar up along the edge of your fabric, so that when your needle comes over that bar, it keeps from gathering your fabric up. So if you're just doing a zigzag and you find that your fabric, you know, has all these little indentations where your thread has pulled it too tight, that bar is what keeps the thread from pulling your fabric in. So then you have this nice, perfect overlock stitch along the edge, and your fabric is still like pristine when you're done stitching. So
Cool.
Get an overlocking foot. Okay, last one here. Joyce wants to know, is there a rule of thumb for when you should lengthen your stitch when sewing garments? I know if I'm sewing a layer of thick fabrics, I should lengthen my stitch for proper tension in the stitches, but how do I know how much to lengthen it by, or is it just trial and error?
I think it is. There's no hard and fast rule of thumb because there are so many different fabrics and, you know, different types of fabrics and thicknesses and all that kind of stuff. So I would say, yes, you're right. Lengthen the stitch when you are stitching something thicker to give it a little bit more room to breathe, so you're not smashing those thick layers down. And do a little bit at a time. So just, you know, 1 point up and stitch a little bit and see how it's going. And if your stitch is like your stitch line is like cutting down into that fabric, lengthen it again a little bit more to try and give that a little bit more room to breathe, and so that your thread is kind of, you know, laying on top of the fabric, and not, you know, digging down and making a little ditch in it. And you want to make sure too, if you open up the layers of your fabric, you want to make sure your stitch is nice and tight and strong too. And when you pull your fabric layers apart, you want to make sure you can't see through the seam, because that's bad too, and you're not getting a good strong seam. So you want to strike the balance, and trial and error is the best way to go about it.
Absolutely, trial and error, and just having a little stitch sample first. Try it out on scrap, you know, absolutely.
Definitely.
Perfect. Well, thank you for answering all of our sewing questions tonight, Nikki. Of course, it's always wonderful, and I'm so glad you put up with my quilting curveballs that I throw at you. So thank you for answering all of those as well.
Wouldn't have it any other way.
Perfect. Well, I hope you all enjoy this live event, and you join us again next month for another one. And Nikki will be back with us as well, and so we will see you then. I hope you all have a good night.